Ladies and gentlemen, from the Universal Church of Freedom, Peace and Justice, Deacon Gerald Celente.
Hello, hello, hello. This is Deacon Celente of the Universal Church of Freedom, Peace, and Justice. Freedom, peace, and justice. On the peace front, it's not very peaceful in the world today. All the talk that has been going on now for a few months is that Russia is ready to attack Ukraine. And again, as we pointed out, back in 2014, in the Trends Journal, an article written by Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, who was the Assistant Treasury Secretary under Ronald Reagan, wrote how the government, the democratic government of Ukraine, was overthrown by the United States. We have an article also that confirms more of that, and it was printed in the Trends Journal on 24 February 2015. In early February 2014, a recording was leaked of Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs Victoria Nuland telling Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine, that the United States was on board to, quote, help glue, end quote, the plan to replace Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych with Arsenii Yatsenyuk. Now remember, in this magazine, Victoria Nuland is quoted as speaking in Washington, D.C. in December 2013, that the United States gave $5 billion to non-governmental organizations in Ukraine to bring democracy to Ukraine. So the overthrow is underway. Yats is the guy, Nuland informed Pyatt, who urged her to move more quickly because, quote, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to torpedo the deal. Fuck the EU, Nuland told Pyatt. Exactly, he responded. Now, anybody could look this up and you could hear this video, and you could look up December 2013, and you can see her address in Washington, D.C. that was brought to you by one sign, Chevron, and the other sign, ExxonMobil. Shortly thereafter, Yanukovych was overthrown and Yats became president. Ukraine agreed to Nuland's demands to make, quote, a new deal with the IMF, which was, quote, necessary for the long-term economic health of the country. It's detailed how the IMF and the European Union wanted to do a deal with Yanukovych because they were in deep trouble financially, Ukraine, and Russia gave them a better deal. And that's when the overthrow began. It's all detailed. Yet, the new Western-leaning Kiev government did not represent the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the east and south who had voted Yanukovych into office. That's the one they threw out. 1 year later, Ukraine is racked by civil war and is in depression. The United States and EU blame Russia for the destabilization because of its support to the Ukrainian separatists. And, as punishment, the U.S. pushed the EU to impose trade sanctions against Russia. Russia retaliated with trade sanctions against Europe. And as we write, there is no end in sight for the civil war. Kiev has been militarily humiliated by the Russian separatists because they keep fighting them. Now, Victoria Nuland, under Barack Obama, was the Assistant Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Under Biden, she is Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She was seen during the uprisings in Maidan Square passing out candy in Ukraine as the protests began. Could you imagine if we had a Russian coming to demonstrations in America, or what's going up out there in Canada, if the Russians are up there supporting the truckers? Oh, it would be terrible. But it's okay for America to go to a country in the Ukraine, their Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and promoting the overthrow, right in public. Her husband is Robert Kagan. And if you Google him up, or go to Wikipedia rather, an American neoconservative and critic of U.S. foreign policy, and a leading advocate of intervention. He calls it liberal intervention. He's the co-founder of the Project for the New American Century. This is a man that sold the lie that people from Iraq were dealing with the terrorists who committed 9/11. The lie came out, it was shown it was a lie. These are the people that are in charge. U.S. intelligence official on Tuesday accused a conservative financial news website with a significant American readership of amplifying Kremlin propaganda, and alleged 5 media outlets targeting Ukrainians have taken direction from Russian spies. The officials said Zero Hedge, which has 1.2 million Twitter followers, published articles created by Moscow-controlled media. You're only allowed to publish articles controlled by American government media. And again, we have detailed when the Iraq War began and how it was being promoted, that around only 1%, according to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, of people that were against the war and saying why the Iraq War was based on lies were permitted to be heard. We're not allowed to hear all sides. We cannot think for ourselves. The Universal Church of Freedom, Peace, and Justice is all about peace. And we only go by the facts. And all now that is being sold is war. Zero Hedge denied the claim. Anyway, Ukraine violence raises prospect of war. Moscow-Kiev trade accusations of attack on front line as Biden cites very high threat. East Ukraine headed for full-scale war, separatist leader. Full-scale war in eastern Ukraine can break out at any moment when an attack by forces loyal to the government of Kiev. They talk about the Russian troops on the Russian-Ukraine border. What they're not talking about are the so-called 100,000 Kiev troops on the Donbass border. These are Russians that don't want to become part of the overthrow of the Ukraine government. That's up to them. That's not our business. This is their business. Kiev can start a full-scale assault on Donbass at any moment. The situation is critical, said Denis Pushlin. And he's the head of the Donetsk People's Republic. His comments came about an hour after an explosion outside the Donetsk government building, which turned out to be a car bomb targeting regional police chief Denis Sionkov. He was not injured in the blast. There were no reports of casualties, only material damage. Pushlin called the bombing a sabotage in preparation for an assault by Kiev. The U.S. and NATO have claimed over the past 3 months that Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine, to the point where Kiev government asking them to tone down the rhetoric, as it was spreading undue panic and hurting the country's economy. Moscow has rejected the allegations of an attack as fake news. Just keeps going on and on. They're blaming the decline of the U.S. equity markets on the buildup of a Russian-Ukraine war. The markets aren't affected by that at all. The market's affected by the Yemen war. Were they affected by the Libyan war? Were they affected by the Iraq war? Were they affected by the Afghan war? All wars, by the way, started by America. Oh, I forgot the Syrian war that only killed about 625,000 people. Has nothing to do with the Ukraine war. It has to do with interest rates rising and a artificially propped up equity markets since the COVID war began, ready to decline. But they're blaming that too on the Russians. As I keep saying, when all else fails, they take you to war. What followed the Great Depression? World War II. What followed the dot-com bust? The Afghan war. People's minds get off it. And most people are against going to war. But when you have a false flag attack, as we've been warning now for several months, people believe it. There was a thing called the Gulf of Tonkin in the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, how the Vietnamese attacked an American ship. First of all, what was an American ship doing way over there off the coast of Vietnam? Could you imagine if you had Vietnamese ships off the coast of California or New York? And it was a total lie that killed over 3 million Vietnamese people, poisoned the country with Agent Orange, killed some 60,000 American troops, wounded hundreds of thousands physically and mentally. Wars based on lies. Like Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda, and a guy like Kagan making up the story that they were involved in 9/11. We are at very critical times. The universal church is about freedom, peace, and justice. And now I just talked about peace and how no one seems to care about it. You're not hearing the religions coming out and saying, stop this. You're not hearing the politicians say, no, no, please, this has to calm down. We need peace. And freedom and justice. What's going on up in Canada with the Freedom Convoy. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has issued an emergency act that robs the people of their civil liberties. I'm mentioning this because of all the things that it does and how easy it happened. Because when war breaks out, whether it's the COVID wars we saw, our freedom was robbed from us, and no justice, they will determine, when they wish, an emergency declaration that will shut down banks, shut you out of your money, just like they're doing up in Canada for people that are protesting. Canadian Civil Liberties Association suing Trudeau government over Emergency Act declaration. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, a nonprofit that advocates for civil liberties and constitutional rights, initiated legal proceedings against the government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau over its decision to invoke Emergencies Act following mass peaceful protests against mandatory vaccinations, according to CCLA representatives who held the press conference this past Thursday. These are their words. Quote, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association has spoken out loudly against this declaration, and today we have our own announcement. We are taking the government of Canada to court. The organization has said the Emergency Act can only be enacted when a situation, quote, seriously threatens the ability of the government of Canada to preserve sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada, or when the situation cannot be effectively dealt with under any other law of Canada. So what Canada is doing, if they did this in other countries that America doesn't like, if the leader of that country stopped peaceful protests, oh, that would be big news. But it's okay when an ally does it. If this happened in Romania or Bulgaria or Yugoslavia, there's still a Yugoslavia? Oh, I remember. That was the one that Bill Clinton destroyed. The Kosovo War, wonderful. You're only allowed to hear one side. Freedom and justice robbed right in front of our eyes. And they will rob us of anything they can in the march to war and the march to power. United we stand, divided we fall. Please do what you can to join the Universal Church of Freedom, Peace, and Justice in our movement to restore what has been stolen from us and bring back liberty, life, joy, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes, the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that was a foundation for the Declaration of Independence that has been robbed from us. If this Ukraine war continues to escalate, it could be the beginning of World War III. And when they asked Albert Einstein, a man who knew a thing or two about building atomic weapons, what kind of weaponry will be used to fight the Third World War? He said, I don't know. But they'll be using sticks and stones to fight the fourth. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.